Okay, we're recording. Good morning, welcome, or good afternoon in other parts of the world. I'm Madeline Yates with Campus Compact Mid-Atlantic, and we're very happy to welcome you to our third guided conversation in this series of webinars co-sponsored and co-hosted with the Middle States Commission for Higher Education, New York, Pennsylvania Campus Compact, and New Jersey Campus Compact. We have upwards of 150 participants registered from roughly 100 colleges and universities ranging from Ireland to Beirut. And a number of our presidents are also on this webinar, including some of our board members, provosts, and other leaders of civic engagement on your campuses. So thank you for joining us. Just as a reminder, we are recording these guided conversations, and if you need closed captioning, simply press the button at the bottom of your screen. We also keep the recordings on our Campus Compact Mid-Atlantic website, so you're welcome to access them there along with summary notes following the conversations. I also encourage you to register for our two remaining events. There's one in March 17th, and then one in April focused on the Carnegie Engagement Connections, and the link should be in the chat for you to register. Please definitely use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to ask questions. And we will remind you of that when we get to the Q&A section. This is envisioned as a conversation, so we really encourage you to participate. And if questions come in that we're not able to get to, we will compile that with responses after the fact. We really see this series as the beginning of a conversation about the intersection of community engagement and the standards. So if others are interested in taking the conversation further, we strongly encourage you simply to drill deeper and reach out by phoning or email as we figure out how to scaffold out and support this conversation further. Before introducing our honored speakers, I would like to mention for a moment the context of this conversation. I think that entering into any conversation about the intersection of civic and community engagement and the standards has to realize the backdrop of what's been happening, certainly in our country most recently with the insurrection on Capitol Hill, but simply the pandemic, the gross disparities of inequities in our country and around the world, and the racial and social justice movements that surround us and that we are all part of, that have contributed to where we are in higher education today. So that is simply the backdrop, and I think frames the importance of this conversation. So with that, I would like to introduce you to the others on our call. First, we will hear from Edna Corbett, Vice President, Institutional Field Relations with the Middle States Commission for Higher Education. And then Dr. Julie Ramsey, recently retired after multiple years as Vice President of College Life and Dean of Students at Gettysburg College, and still leading Gettysburg College's strategic planning initiatives. Julie has been, I think, on probably about a dozen Middle States site visits and review visits. Dr. Monica Walker is joining us as the Dean of Instruction, School of Writing, Literacy, and Languages with the Community College of Baltimore County. And Michelle Wolf is the Executive Director of the Shriver Center at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And both Michelle and Monica have served for many years on our own network's Senior Advisory Group for Engagement and are, again, leaders in this field for decades. Finally, Laurie Worrell is my my friend and my colleague as the executive director of Campus Compact New York, Pennsylvania, and will be helping to shepherd the Q&A section of our conversation. With that, Edna, would you like to begin in framing some of your thoughts about the intersection with standards 3, 4, and 5?
Thank you, Madeline. It is a pleasure to participate in this conversation today with my colleagues. As my colleague, Dr. Ellie Fogarty, expressed in the last guided conversation, an institution accredited by the Middle States Commission on Higher Education can state with confidence, when our students are well served, society is well served. The pandemic has highlighted and amplified fragilities and inequalities in our society. Now more than ever, institutions of higher education are asking themselves, what is the role of our institution in society? How are we preparing our students to promote social integration and respond to crisis situations? The self-study process requires that institutions identify institutional priorities that will be addressed in their self-reflection process. Our colleague, Dr. Sean McKittrick, examined the self-study reports from the last cohort of institutions to determine patterns and common themes in institutional priorities. It probably will not surprise you to learn that after improving finances, the next 3 most popular priorities were diversity, equity, and inclusion, improving student achievement, and developing community and strategic partnerships. During self-study, institutions of higher education examine their compliance with the MSCHE standards through the lens of their identified priorities. As part of that process, institutions conduct a detailed analysis to determine which standards connect most closely with those priorities. If an institution has identified one of the 3 priorities I just mentioned, they often connect them to one or more of the 3 standards we are discussing today. Standard 3 states that, quote, an institution provides students with learning experiences that are characterized by rigor and coherence at all program, certificate, and degree levels, regardless of instructional modality. All learning experiences regardless of modality, program pace, or schedule, level, and setting are consistent with higher education expectations. Furthermore, the 5th criterion within that standard makes a clear connection with the goals of civic and community engagement by outlining the expectation that the institution's curriculum include a general education program that offers, quote, a sufficient scope to draw students into new areas of intellectual experience, expanding their cultural and global awareness and cultural sensitivity, and preparing them to make well-reasoned judgments outside as well as within their academic field, end quote. Through the design and implementation of rigorous educational programs that collaborate locally, building alliances between scientists, artists, students, local authorities, and society, higher education institutions can become drivers of sustainability and resilience in their local community, while at the same time demonstrating compliance with the expectations of the standards. The learning experiences provided by the institution may include a variety of civic and community engagement initiatives, such as service learning, community-based instruction, and other high-impact practices. During self-study, institutions may demonstrate how their academic programs address, for example, a priority related to developing community and strategic partnerships by examining whether their educational programs include significant study of the needs of the community while assisting students in developing the networking and partnership building skills that are so valued in the labor marketplace. In Standard 4, support of the student experience, the institution commits to student retention, persistence, completion, and success through a coherent and effective support system sustained by qualified professionals, which enhances the quality of the learning environment, contributes to the educational experience, and fosters student success. As the institution examines its priority, for example, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or improving student success, It can use the lens of civic and community engagement to examine its own support programs and services, to determine whether traditionally underrepresented student groups are being properly served, whether students are learning appropriate contextual information to inform their extracurricular experiences, and whether its leadership opportunities are preparing students to connect with community and internalize democratic values. We have seen institutions engage in this type of analysis, emphasizing in their self-study reports not how many services and programs they have or how many students participate in one or more student activities, but how the institution's support of the student experience has a direct impact on the student's growth and development. For it is this growth and development that will help them go on to make a difference in their own communities. Finally, Standard 5, Educational Effectiveness Assessment, requires that institutions have clearly stated educational goals at the institution and degree program levels, which are interrelated with one another, with relevant educational experiences, and with the institution's mission. This standard takes us back to the root of the self-reflection process. Are we truly accomplishing the goals and objectives we have set for ourselves and for our students? This is where an institution will demonstrate how well it is living its mission, to what extent students are accomplishing the stated learning outcomes, and whether it is meeting the expectations for institutions of higher education. As institutions engage in the self-study process to demonstrate compliance with this standard, it is important for programs to demonstrate the impact of their initiatives on student learning. It is through the appropriate implementation of assessment practices that institutions can demonstrate the value of the experiences they provide, and that they are serving their students well and are contributing to the improvement of this ever-changing world in which we live. Now I'll pass it on to Dr. Ramsey.
Thank you, Edna. And it's a pleasure to be here today. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you all about this important topic. As Madeline mentioned, I've just wrapped up a 30-year stint as Dean of Students and Vice President for College Life, and have participated in a number of Middle States visits. So that's kind of my perspective. I'm also involved, as she mentioned, in our strategic planning process, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But I always start with in thinking about these things, I start with the mission statement. And I would imagine that most of your mission statements have some reference to citizenship, community engagement, being an effective leader in the context of their communities. So something that that speaks in the mission statement to these goals. Gettysburg College uses the phrase effective leadership and socially responsible citizenship. So those are the goals we have in mind for our graduates. And over my tenure, during my tenure, particularly the college founded in 1990 a Center for Public Service, which started to bring together a number of activities focusing on volunteerism in the community, and then started significant outreach to the faculty and to the community, so that there was a three-way partnership between faculty, community members, and students, facilitated by the Center for Public Service. And through that work over the years, the programs focusing on community engagement have really just blossomed, as I'm sure they have at your institutions as well. The curricular piece has become a really significant piece of the community engagement work. We have dozens and dozens of courses that have a community-based learning. We have a regular liaison with the Provost's office that works with us. The Center for Public Service is housed on the student life side. So we have a representative in the Provost's office who assists with that ongoing relationship building. And of course, at Gettysburg, I'm sure like your institutions, there's been an enormous amount of growth and development in area of peace and justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, We have an Eisenhower Institute, which focuses on significant public policy issues. We have a funded or endowed leadership center, again, on the co-curricular side. And we have very, very strong co-curricular programs that have a strong learning component where students are prepared before they enter the community engagement, work with organizations, and there's a good deal of reflection after the fact. So I'm only telling you this in the sense that if you think about the phrase, let 1,000 flowers bloom, 1,000 flowers have bloomed in this space at Gettysburg College over the last couple of decades. So we're starting to think about how to take this to the next level. What does that mean? And the Middle States, as I prepared for this, turned out that the Middle States standards are very helpful in guiding us in thinking about how do we take this to the next level? How effective have we been as an institution at stating our learning goals and assessments around this topic? And I do think there is some room for improvement at Gettysburg and perhaps at your institutions as well. And that is part of the strategic planning process that has begun at Gettysburg College. So we are thinking very specifically about this area of community engagement and how to embed that more deeply, more coherently, et cetera. So let me say a little bit more about those efforts. So as Edna mentioned, Standard 3, the phrase I lift up that jumps out to me in Standard 3 is the one you read, Edna, where it talks about learning outcomes that are characterized by rigor and coherence. And I think we would all recognize that when you let 1,000 flowers bloom, coherence may not be the first thing that is the outcome of that kind of effort. And while I'm sure that all of these programs, the courses, the co-curricular components, they all have articulated learning outcomes in mind, I don't think that there is a coherent set of learning outcomes from these collective efforts. So if we think about, we've said we want to graduate socially responsible citizens. How do we know that we're doing that? We may know that a particular program, particular activity, being engaging in community-based research or courses, et cetera, they may have an impact. And in fact, I know they do because students certainly report that. But collectively and institutionally, I don't think we've met the standard of rigorous and coherent assessment. So the first thing that stands out to me that is needed is kind of a step back where we would say to ourselves and our community, what are the knowledge, skills, attitudes that are embedded in being a socially responsible citizen? So what does that really mean when we think about the behaviors, the skills and knowledge that we want students to come away with? And there are lots of models in the field, templates that have been developed on this topic. And I don't think we have to recreate the wheel. I think we just have to kind of work through that as a community to decide which one fits our community the best, and how do we tweak that to make that, Gettysburg, that we own that at Gettysburg College. I do think these are new areas of intellectual experience for students, and that, again, part of Standard 3 needs to be part of the conversation. In Standard 4, there are two questions that I would lift up for Gettysburg as a result of Standard 4. We certainly are concerned about retention and the relationship between community-based activity, community engagement, and retention is one that we need to gather more data on. We simply have not, again, lifted that up as an institutional priority in terms of retention, gathering data. The other question I would ask in regard to standard 4 is, what is the value added of community engagement activity? So how does it relate to other priorities that we have? Madeline mentioned, diversity, social justice, equity, et cetera. That is a very important connection. They're not the same, but how do we see how those two priorities for the institution might intersect? And to my mind, this really needs to be a priority that the leadership of the institution lifts up. I don't think that retention, for example, we can start collecting a lot of retention data, especially across the institution, unless we have support at the leadership level. In terms of standard 5, that's where we get into the real hardcore assessment of these activities. So once we have, and again, I would say I think we're doing an outstanding job on assessing programmatic level impact and outcomes. But again, how do we wrap all that up and think about it in an institutional sense, rather than just in these various silos that we all tend to operate in, and kind of give a nod to each other. Yeah, I care about that too, so we're good. So, but really think about it institutionally. I've heard it, this is not my phrase, but I've heard it described as thinking about it in terms of an ecosystem. So how do we create an ecosystem of, or maybe it's already there, but how do we recognize and kind of formalize to some extent those partners, those programs, those individuals, those courses? How can we kind of wrap that up into an ecosystem that is focused on these issues for the campus community? And how do we better align their efforts at every level? So that actually is one of the things I would say about, it's important in my mind to be looking at alumni in terms of especially we think about assessment. It's important to me to assess what are alumni actually doing. So they may have the skills, but are they using those skills in the world of being effective citizens? It's not enough to just know how, but are they actually using those skills that we believe we've provided them? And then on a closing note, I would want to say that, even as we are thinking about our learning goals around community engagement, I would want us to revisit those definitions to some extent to make sure that democratic engagement is also included. Some places we use the term civic engagement, and some of these terms appeal more to some people than others. But I think the events of the last several years or months, some of which Madeline pointed to, have demonstrated that our democracy and our democratic institutions need some real work. And we need to be, as a higher education community, I think, really focused on that issue. And I'm afraid that community engagement doesn't always mean that we have democratic engagement as well. And I'll just I'll end with a quote that I really like from AAC&U's document called A Crucible Moment, College Learning and Democracy's Future. And it says that, it's talking about civic education, while still essential, is no longer nearly enough. This is the quote: Americans still need to understand how their political systems work and how to influence them, but they also need to understand the cultural and global context in which democracy is both deeply valued and deeply contested. So when I say democratic engagement, that's the context, that's the kind of framing that I would put on that, and just try to make a plug that we think hard as a set of institutions about democratic engagement as well. And I'll stop there. Turn it over to Dr. Monica Walker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramsey. was struck by your comments when you were speaking about Standard 3 and the thoughts that you had about Gettysburg's college experience and thinking about rigor and consistency as relates to high impact practices. At the Community College of Baltimore County, we also thought about that in terms of the educational experiences that we were providing our students and thinking about high impact practices and the manner in which we were engaging our students around community and civic engagement. We looked to the literature and thinking about the characteristics of those experiences that our students were having and wanted to ensure that we were doing those high impact practices well, making sure that those experiences were not just one-time experiences in terms of engaging our community partners, ensuring that we were able to scale up high impact practices to the extent that our students had access to those experiences and were able to spend a significant amount of time in the community, time and effort, being able to, over an extended period of time, to be able to interact with their peers over important substantive matters, be able to have experiences with community members in diverse settings and to receive constructive feedback, all of those characteristics that do indeed reflect a quality high impact practice. And in terms of rigor and consistency, I want to mention too that we are guided by the Community College Survey of Student Engagement as a benchmark. And we do reference that in our Middle States self-study as a guide. We do look to that as an assessment tool to use it as a metric for us to determine how we're faring as an institution. And our students do let us know from our administration of that instrument, from administration to administration, how we're faring in terms of the extent to which we are engaging our students around academic rigor and the other metrics on that instrument. So as an example, in terms of our outcomes around Standard 3, I just wanted to mention one of our projects as relates to high impact practices. About 5 years ago, we similar to what Dr. Ramsey was mentioning around high impact practices, we decided to kind of formalize our efforts around the infusion of high impact practices into our general education courses. As many people often reflect upon and think about, students do not do optional. And many of the practices that are implemented in terms of high impact practices are done so in what we would say a boutique fashion. Not everyone was facilitating learning communities across the institution. Not everyone was facilitating internships or service learning, but everyone had to take general education classes in terms of our student population at the Community College of Baltimore County. And so within our academic affairs office, we were working with our faculty to incorporate a new initiative whereby we invited colleagues to infuse high impact practices within their general education courses, the top highly enrolled general education courses within the institution. And we did just that. We had the high impact practice infusion project. And as an example, in our communication studies 101 course, a course that all of our students have to take, the faculty in that course infused global and diversity learning in that class. And the high impact practice was infused in most, if not all, of the sections of Communication Studies 101 in that first pilot semester, and eventually was scaled up to all sections of that course. And we were able to assess student outcomes for the course, and as compared to students who were not enrolled in sections of the course for Communication Studies, and students who were enrolled in sections where the high impact practice was infused were able to achieve higher success rates and were retained at higher levels as compared to students who are not in the HIPS section. So that's just one example of student success rates that were more favorable in the HIPS infused sections. We were very, very pleased with how students were faring in our HIPS enrolled courses, and through the analysis of those sections, we're able to demonstrate consistency through the infusion project across institution, and we're continuing to scale up the additional, additional projects throughout other highly enrolled courses. Let me also just say that we've done other types of diversity and global learning high impact practices, and we've taken the opportunity to engage students in other enrichment activities and other courses. And at every turn, assessment is a really key part of that. We, with respect to standard 4, have also looked to the opportunity to disaggregate data, because we've been very sensitive to achievement gaps. And data analysis has helped us to see that within the communication studies high impact practice, that we've been able to see success in terms of narrowing of achievement gaps there. And that's been very exciting for us to note. At this time, I'm going to take the opportunity to invite my colleague at the University of Maryland at Baltimore County, Ms. Wolf, to share some exciting successes there at her institution. Michelle?
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Appreciate this opportunity to talk with everyone and have this discussion. I come at this as a community engagement practitioner over the last 30 years. So that's my perspective. Across our campus at UMBC, in several departments and centers, we have numerous faculty and staff members working with hundreds of community-based partners to provide community and civic engagement opportunities to thousands of our undergraduate and graduate students. One way we're working towards ensuring these experiences are rigorous and coherent as related to Standard 3 and are substantive and meaningful for our students and our community partners is through institutionalized resources and infrastructure. The Shriver Center, for example, provides students with opportunities to work with partners throughout the Baltimore region. These opportunities include our Service Learning Community Engagement Program, our Public Service Scholars Programs, our Shriver Peace Worker Fellows Program, and our Choice Program. These initiatives are focused on building and sustaining reciprocal and mutually beneficial partnerships that move us towards race equity and social justice, goals that we've aspired to over the 30+ year history of the center, and as everybody's been mentioning, are now more necessary than ever. The Shriver Center also has had a Service Learning Community Engagement practicum in place since 1990. This standalone 0 credit course ensures, for example, accountability. The practicum is part of students' academic transcript and carries a pass-fail grade. It also provides community-based partners with parameters for working with students to create meaningful, reciprocal, and mutually beneficial experiences. It's also a mechanism for expectation and goal setting. As a component of the accountability piece, students and community-based partners together set their expectations for the semester and the goals they all hope to accomplish. The practicum also is a mechanism for measuring student learning with a particular focus from our perspective on affective skills, not just cognitive ones. And these skills include critical reflection. It's also a tool for faculty to integrate service learning community engagement into their courses with flexibility to adapt the components of the practicum to fit their interests, content, and course goals. For example, faculty teaching first-year seminars and courses across departments like sociology, English, education, and information systems integrate service learning community engagement in partnership with us at the Shriver Center. The practicum also provides an ongoing feedback loop for all of our partners, and it allows for relationship sustainability. We also have some great data sources to support the ideal that our students' community engagement experiences are enhancing their overall success, including retention, graduation rates, and sense of belonging as it relates to Standard 4. Our community engagement also helps our institution assess educational effectiveness, including students' development of cognitive and affective competencies as it relates to Standard 5. So data from several sources suggest the following. So just a couple examples. According to Dr. Delana Gregg's 2019 dissertation entitled Effects of High Impact Practices on First Generation College Students' Academic Success, for first-time, first-generation college students, so a specific subpopulation of students at higher risk of attrition, service learning had statistically significant effects on student success, including final grade point average, persistence, and graduation. Also from the National Study of Living Learning Programs annual survey for all UMBC Living Learning Community residents, this was one of the questions asked. To what degree has living in on-campus housing contributed to your sense of belonging to this institution? For the Shriver Center Living Learning Community residents, their experience as a community of students who live, learn, and serve together, this contributed to their sense of belonging, illustrated by them collectively giving a high degree of agreement to the question I mentioned, giving a rating of 6.04 out of 7 compared to a 5.55 out of 7 mean for all UMBC Living Learning Community residents. And as related to Standard 5, an area to explore related to assessing educational effectiveness includes focusing not just on cognitive competency development, but also on affective competency, skill building, and enhancement. The need for students to develop skills beyond academic content extends to their preparation for careers post-graduation and to becoming citizens who uphold our ideals of equity and justice. Students who engage in experiences like community and civic engagement build skills that employers and society in general are seeking in our college graduates. These skills are represented in these examples of some impact assessment that we've done on campus. So for example, as a direct measure, rubrics are being used to assess students' written reflections and measure their development in, for example, critical reflection, self-confidence, self-awareness, leadership, and perspective taking following their service learning and community engagement experiences. Also through the Shriver Center End of Experience Practicum Survey, which students complete at the end of each semester, students self-reported a direct impact of their experience on skill development as follows. And this is from the most recent report that we did. 93% reported an increase in their interpersonal communication skills, 88% indicated increase in awareness of social responsibilities, 85% indicated increase in their ability to solve problems, and 84% indicated agreement in an increase in their teamwork and collaboration. Also, in a recent evaluation of our public service scholars programs, of the alumni of those programs included that all respondents except for one indicated employment or enrollment in a graduate program in the public and or social sector after graduation, which can be seen as an indication of some of the longitudinal impact of these programs on participants. So I'll end with a quick quote from one of our service learning and community engagement alums, who's currently an executive director of a local nonprofit. Quote, "The Shriver Center opens the door to life-changing experiences for students. The real-world experience more than complements what is taught in the classroom. It is a critical resource that helps shape the next group of leaders who will promote social justice." And I think I'm turning it back to Lori.
Madeline, did you want to say anything before we get started on questions and answers?
Just thank you.
Yes,
Fantastic comments.
Absolutely. I couldn't ask for a richer conversation. At this point, we invite all of you who are listening to ask some questions. You can do that through the Q&A feature on your Zoom menu at the bottom of the screen. But I'd like to start us off in this portion of the webinar, circling back to something that Dr. Ramsey mentioned in her comments about the need to begin to draw an explicit connection between community and civic engagement and democracy, sort of democratic education. And I'm just curious, just to open up the conversation, how can you imagine that occurring at your institutions, at a variety of institutions, and how can you imagine feeding that back into a self-assessment study for reaccreditation? I'm just going to open it up, and whoever has the first comments gets to start.
I'll go ahead.
Please, good, please.
So I mentioned about what we've been trying to look at over the last several years is the integration of affective competency development in synergy with cognitive competency development. And so we've worked for the last 6 years on coming up with a working list of what we call affective functional competencies at UMBC. And those competencies really go toward this idea of promoting the ideals of democracy. And just to name a couple of them, and I mentioned a couple of them in my remarks, but perspective taking, sensitivity to context and informed action, cultural global humility and inclusive action, and shared humanness and transformational action. And I think, those competencies, like I said, really align, I think, with the ideals of democracy around equity and justice and inclusion. We were very intentional in thinking about not just the sort of thinking and reflective part of the competencies, but also moving toward action, which I think is partly what Dr. Ramsey is talking about in terms of the democratic engagement part. So not just, reflecting on those ideals of shared humanness or cultural humility, but also moving toward the action part. So that's why we were intentional including those aspects as part of those competencies. And then we really believe strongly that community and civic engagement are spaces in which students can develop and build and enhance those competencies and move toward action in those areas.
Just to build on Michelle's point, I think she's articulated very well. There are, I think, a lot of overlapping competencies for the two fields, and that I wouldn't even really say they're two separate fields, but maybe two wings of the field. I think a couple others I would name would be, of course, communication is critical. And so by democratic action, for example, I don't think we mean just voting. I think we mean advocacy, influence, trying to understand and shape policy decisions that are made in one's community, whether that's the local, regional, or federal level, global level, really. I mean, how do you influence change? And democracy is an important vehicle for advancing change. And it's in that kind of context, I think we want to think about these two together.
Excellent. Anyone else want to respond to that question?
Can I just add one other thought?
Absolutely.
And again, with this synergy across the two, I think with the community engagement piece, I think it's really important to understand what's happening in communities by partnering with communities. And once you have sort of that foundational understanding, connecting with the policy legislative part of things.
I'd like to add
Please.
the self-study process. If you consider the university or the college as a community, the self-study process requires transparency and requires engagement from different places, different people. One of the things that when I see that a self-study steering committee or the working groups are only comprised of mostly one type of group, one of the first things I say is, where are the rest of the people? There has to be engagement from staff, engagement from all different kinds of staff, engagement from students from different levels. And so I think the self-study process can be a good example of how an institution can be transparent and can seek input, which is what we hope to see in a democratic society where people are able to provide their input. And as you say, how do you influence change? You can do that through that input and through that self-reflection and those self-recommendations that institutions develop as part of the self-study.
So in a way, it's funny because I was going to ask you, Dr. Corbett, from an institutional assessment kind of perspective, how you would go about measuring or looking at the connection between the two. But in a way, you're also suggesting that the institution itself engage in democratic practice with regard to the self-study. Very interesting. Michelle, I was wondering, we have a question from the audience. The question is, can you say a bit more about your approach to assessing affective competencies and defining and connecting those competencies to kind of critical outcomes of your work?
Yeah, sure. So we're just starting in this work with the assessment piece. We're working with our, they just changed their name. So I was looking at my notes to find, it's our Faculty Development Center, which is now the Center for the Advancement of Learning and Teaching. So we're working in partnership with them to develop rubrics that can measure. So what we're hoping faculty and staff will do is integrate the affective competencies into student learning outcomes, whether it's in courses or co-curricular types of activities, and then use rubrics that we're working, as I mentioned, in partnership with our Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning and Teaching to use student artifacts or other direct measures and use those rubrics to see the development or enhancement of those competencies for students. So I'll give you one example. So I mentioned the practicum through the Schreiber Center Service Learning Community Engagement Program. So that team worked with the Center for Learning and Teaching to develop a rubric so that they could use, I think I mentioned this, they could use students' written reflections, which are part of that practicum, to look at perspective taking and sensitivity to context and some of those other affective competencies. So that's one example. Another example is with our graduate level service learning program, which is our Schreiber Peace Worker program for return Peace Corps volunteers. They use both our gen ed cognitive competencies and the affective competencies, and did a curriculum map and aligned those competencies with their 2-year curriculum, and are looking at different ways of assessing the development of those competencies over the 2 years that those graduate students are in the program, with tools like digital stories and different ways that it's woven into their curricula.
So in a way, you've addressed the issue of kind of scaling up to a more of an institutional level, as opposed to just kind of measuring right now on your own program, which would be a subset of the institution's students, right?
Yeah, we're trying it. Another example is with first year seminars. They've also developed rubrics to fit for their particular courses, and then are integrating some of those affective competencies into student learning outcomes through first year experience. So we're working on, it's a work in progress for sure, but we're working on incrementally on that. Yes.
Dr. Walker, did you want to add anything to Michelle's comments?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the importance of the data and scale up, and how we're, in terms of our next steps, ensuring that we're getting the data into the hands of our stakeholders. It's important to have ongoing dialogue and discussion about the data and its importance in terms of driving our decisions and next steps. And it's important to have our community partners around the table when we're thinking about our stakeholders and engaging them in the life cycle of these initiatives, and thinking about advancing the work of community engagement and making a difference in our communities. And so thinking about the success of the work of our students, and in terms of assessment, ensuring that we are getting the full picture and the feedback that our community partners will give us to inform the analysis of just how successful we're being in terms of providing the full picture for our self-study. We've got to have the voice from the larger community. And that's only going to be possible if we're able to have our community partners at the table. And so thinking about having the community voice as a part of that, to inform the self-study as part of the work that we're doing in terms of the middle states self-study assessment, and that will involve collaboration. Just thinking about that as part of the work that we're doing.
I tell you, having community partners around the table, you're speaking my language. Well said, well said. I'm also curious, in addition to connecting civic engagement, civic and community engagement to democracy, how can you imagine, or how are you drawing an explicit connection to issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? I myself have seen service learning programs, run service learning programs where, depending upon the faculty member, those issues are either central to the course and to the student's experience, or they're not. And I'm just curious about how each of your institutions are addressing that issue, the issue of integrating justice, equity, diversity, inclusion into explicitly the students' community and civic engagement experience.
Well, I'll offer a couple thoughts. One is that I think it has to be, and for us is become a much more central part of the training and discussions that we have with students before they go into communities, in partnership with the communities, and then as part of the reflection on the back end. And whether that's a course or a volunteer opportunity, it has to be a much more central, I think, a much more central part of any conversation around community engagement. So I think it just has to be start to be baked in a very deliberate way. I don't see any way around that, actually.
Agreed.
I agree completely. And yeah, it's a work in progress to, in terms, especially with the preparation part. I think that's a critical part of the process, and, deepening understanding and awareness for students of the communities with whom they're working. So I totally agree with that. Going back to the affective competency piece, that's where we also are baking it in, ensuring that those are seen as the goals, the learning goals for the students who are engaging, for example, with the service learning community engagement program. Also, we're a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Campus Center. So that is important for our campus, and it originated within the choice program at the Shiver Center, and we're pushing it out through the Shiver Center and then through the campus. So that's also work in progress to focus on the ideals through Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Going back to Dr. Walker's comment about having partners at the table, we really working to be intentional about that. And we developed what we call our partnership values, principles, and practices guide. And that came out of a conversation that we had with our partners to develop sort of our foundational values around authentic partnership. So I think, and integrating that across our programs too gets to the point that you were making, Lori.
Nice. Well, one thing I've learned from doing these guided conversations with Madeline is that an hour is never enough to really get to the meat of what everybody's saying. You all have been so gracious and succinct and pointed. It's been a lovely conversation. I'd like to offer each of you the opportunity to just make some closing remarks, maybe comment on each other's ideas, but whatever you have to offer to this particular conversation. Dr. Walker, would you like to start?
Sure. I've enjoyed this rich conversation today. We are right now in the process of working on our self-study. And so each panelist today has given me a lot to think about, especially in thinking about our mission and just reinforcing who we are as an institution and why we do what we do. So thank you to each person here on the panel. Our president at the Community College of Baltimore County, if she were here today on this panel, she would want me to tell you that we transform lives, we prepare students to enrich our communities. And as part of our vision for what we will continue to do, both now and in the future, is that we want to make learning powerful for our students, because community is everything. It is paramount for us. And I think that in thinking about community and civic engagement, we're going to move forward in that spirit, keeping community and civic engagement at the forefront. So thank you for this opportunity today to engage in this conversation.
Thank you for your time. Dr. Ramsey.
Sure. I've enjoyed the conversation as well. I always learn things from my colleagues. I'll be taking, snippets of what you've outlined as back to my group. I just want to say, I want to reiterate that this is a foundational part of the college's strategic plan. And I guess the point I'd like to make about that, and the same thing happens when the Middle States study is underway, is that we start to focus on some things more than others. And that, in a sense, is a political decision. And I just want to encourage you to continue to bring these issues up to your vice presidents and the president, because ultimately they have a lot of sway over how to allocate those scarce resources, whether sometimes those resources are financial, but more and more I'm finding that they're time. Time is the most precious resource we have in higher education, and particularly around assessment, bringing faculty together, using faculty time to design these programs and design common learning goals. Those are big decisions. And so it's that constant cultivation of both academic, I think academic leadership, student life leadership, and ultimately presidential leadership. So that, I guess I'll stop on that point.
Important point. Ms. Wolf.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been a great experience, and in the preparation for this, and then the discussion today, and it really has gone very quickly. It's just a couple of thoughts in my mind. One is just the richness of the synergies across all the different areas that we've talked about, and how important it is to think about looking at things in working collaboration together. Dr. Corbett, I think, brought up a great insight about with the Middle States self-study having so many, a variety of people at the table. And we took a very similar strategy with our Carnegie Community Engagement Classification self-study. We received classification in this past year in 2020, and that made it such a robust and important process. And we kept saying that throughout the process of doing the application. That was the beginning of it, not the end result. I think it's important to think in that way when you're thinking about community and civic engagement, that it's this ongoing process of building these collaborations and partnerships across the different stakeholders or partners. So I think this conversation is great for sort of highlighting that. And also, I was so excited when Madeline started talking about this connection between Campus Compact and Middle States, because for community engagement, I think it lifts it up in terms of thinking about priorities, like Dr. Ramsey was talking about, and shining a light on community and civic engagement as a priority for campuses, and then so tying it in with Middle States, I think is really critical. And just to wrap up, I think higher education plays such a critical role in providing opportunities for students and faculty and community partners to do this critically important work. So I appreciate having this forum to talk about it.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Corbett.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Madeline. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate being a part of it. If there's one thing that has come across to me is that higher education institutions are interdependent with their communities. They really rely on each other. But I want to highlight a couple of things. I appreciate Dr. Ramsey's emphasis of what are the knowledge, skills, and ability needed for civic engagement. And I want to add, how do we assess them? And I think that's what Ms. Wolf has been talking about in terms of assessing, using rubrics and finding a way to demonstrate that the students have met or have achieved those. I love Dr. Walker's emphasis on data. Throughout the years, this one thing that we have always saying, use the data to tell the story. And that is an excellent way to succeed in your self-study process. And Ms. Wolf, I do appreciate the fact that you're talking about infusing throughout the curriculum, because it's not about one course. You don't develop those knowledge, skills, and abilities in one course. It's not just in freshman or first year seminar. It is throughout. And I think that is the importance of creating building blocks, going back to those abilities and skills, creating building blocks so we can check at the end what an impact our institution has had. So thank you so much. I think all of the conversation today can be very helpful for institutions as they engage in their self-study.
Thank you. It could not be richer. I consider this just the beginning of the conversation. We are at 11 o'clock. Cannot thank the panelists enough. Again, what would a developmental model really look like? Not even in higher ed, but K-12 through higher ed and through to looking at alums. What would that really look like? And how would we know that those knowledge, skills, attitudes, and understandings were really functioning and in place and fulfilling the public purposes of higher ed? So we invite you to register for our next webinars, and thank you all.